I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me. Banned in China. What we're about to discuss is banned in the People's Republic of China. So those of you who will listen to this podcast understand what we're discussing you can't see. The Chinese firewall, Weibo, everything's taken down. Arthur Waldron, of Lauder Professor of International Relations at the University of Pennsylvania, joins us now. This is a fresh story, breaking news, surrounding the story of corruption these last 50 or 60 years under the People's Republic of China's Communist Party, the Central Committee, especially since the Chinese miracle of these last 20 years. Within these last hours, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, there's a website, ICIJ, based in Washington, D.C., identifies 22,000 owners of companies and trusts in the British Virgin Islands, Samoa, and other offshore centers. These trusts, this offshore parking, tax havens they're called if you're an American, prosperous American citizen. These tax havens are unremarkable except for the fact, we learn in this news reporting, that one of the holders of the tax haven is Xi Jinping's brother-in-law. Also, former Premier Wen Jiabao's son and son-in-law and other relatives are said to have these tax havens. Arthur, a very good evening to you. All right, we're not shocked, but still, this is a blow to Xi Jinping. Do you believe at this point, because they've banned this in China, that he can suppress this, that the Chinese Communist Party can pretend it didn't happen? Good evening to you, Arthur.
Good evening. No, John, I think that China is open enough now, porous enough now, that people all over China are going to know this. They know it. They know it now. And they're going to find it out. And the only way that they can stop, there's really no way they could stop that because they've dismantled the system that used to keep China completely and utterly isolated from the world. And to understand the impact, just imagine such a story breaking about an American president or a Japanese prime minister or even a French president. This is corruption on a scale that is unknown, except perhaps in Arab princedoms, where the public purse can be used privately.
Arthur, what's really important is that you also have 5 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, or former members, also with these tax haven companies. This is an important story in the sense that, you have Xi Jinping. He's been ruler of China for a year. He's coming in and he's trying to say, well, look, we're going to clean up corruption. And then all of a sudden, we have this information. And Xi Jinping is now put in a spot because if he doesn't deal with his brother-in-law, if he doesn't deal with these other people who have tax haven companies, then his anti-corruption efforts will have absolutely no credibility with the Chinese people. And as we know, corruption generally brings down the dynasties. So this is going to be a critical issue for him because, as you point out, the Chinese people are eventually going to know.
I think lots of them already know. They have their ways of keeping informed. I mean, you can direct dial China. 30 years ago you couldn't do that. There are millions of phone conversations going on. You can't monitor all of them. Computer geniuses over there, they can log in and find out what's going on. And people, furthermore, over there have very clear opinions about the moral character of their leadership, and they're not favorable. But what you say is right, because what you're saying is it's not one man's problem, although it is. It's a whole group. It's the whole leadership cadre has now been discovered with their hands or their arms up to the elbow in the kind of pot of gold, exporting it to British colonial possessions where they don't ask very many questions. And that's terrible.
Importantly, no allegation of wrongdoing in holding these tax havens. The detail here that is threatening to the leadership is that they exist. These accounts exist. And that undermines the narrative advanced certainly by Xi Jinping. The leadership, Arthur, lacks legitimacy because there's no election. The legitimacy that Xi Jinping has been promoting is that I will clean up corruption. I will make things better for all of you. His brother-in-law now, not only his brother-in-law, but let's connect it to another princeling. Bo Xilai is in jail for 5 million years, we think.
Right. So
and his wife is self-confessed murderess. However, my memory is the reason he was disgraced publicly and denounced was because, he stole $3 million somewhere in France? Some boondoggle like that.
Yeah, and they owned houses. There's a picture of a house that they owned in the south of France.
All right, so I turn the screw here. Is this Bo Xilai striking back? Are his lieutenants throwing this into Washington's think tanks?
Well, I was saying, I think that it's more than journalists just being fed. I've no doubt there are lots of people in the system who feed things. The system is not cohesive. It is not homogenous because the Chinese people are too smart, too well-traveled, too educated, and all the rest for that. But on the other hand, there are a lot of Chinese who are really, really profoundly anti-regime, and they're very smart, and they spend all their time doing things like figuring out how to break through the firewall or connect the dots on the financial affairs of high officials, and they can work through reams of stuff. And apparently this all started with a great cache of information that they got somehow, and then they've had to go through it and sift it and figure it all out. So I think I think that there is real investigative journalism of the type that politicians fear going on here.
And people are leaking. You had
of course, both. It's
both. You had the Bloomberg story about the wealth of Xi Jinping's family. You had the New York Times story about Wen Xiaobao, the now former premier's family. You've got this story, which was an enormous document dump. And we also have that Bloomberg story, which they've killed, about the chairman of Wanda Group basically buying the entire Politburo Standing Committee. When we see that story, the regime is over, because at that point, there is absolutely nothing that they can say.
The police have been detaining anyone who discloses the wealth of the leadership. Is that enough, Arthur? Can they continue to threaten?
As I've said before to both of you, I think that when you try to have a collective leadership,
right,
that is already a problem. If you've got 20 people, even if they're all clean as white as the driven snow, clean, you're going to have disagreements and they won't be able to steer. You can only have one person steering the car. Now, if they're a kleptocracy as well, so they're all competitively stealing and looting the wealth of the Chinese nation and stuff that in theory belongs to the Chinese people and sending it overseas, then that introduces yet another element, which is not only competition among themselves, but also tremendous anger. I mean, when you look at the figures for how much the average Chinese person makes, or the workers who are building these skyscrapers.
There are 100 million people who are migrant workers who have no regular homes and live hand to mouth, yes.
And you go to China and you see them everywhere. There are books about them.
Detail here, I want to establish this, Arthur, right now. These facts, as they're being thrown up, do we believe at this point that the regime is frightened? Would they be frightened of this news?
I think that they would be
mortally terrified.
I think they would be terrified, but they don't know they wouldn't know what to do, because it's undeniable, if you see what I mean.
I do see what you mean. I just want to know, Gordon.
On the hours before this document dump, the trial of an anti-corruption activist in China. This is what the CNN crew was actually filming, harassed over.
And they broke their cameras and sent them out of the public square trying to report. Arthur Waldron at the University of Pennsylvania, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. Ladies and gentlemen, this is breaking news. Watch this. I'm John Batchelor.